Right, today is January the 9th in 2023, and my guest is Patri Friedman. Patri is the founder of the Seasteading Institute and general partner at Pronomos Capital. Patri is one, if not the foremost thinker behind the idea of competitive governance, a concept underpinning much of what this podcast is about and what I'm working on. We'll talk about Patri's life's work and the venture funding side of funding new cities or government's experiments to foster human progress and flourishing. Patri, welcome to the show.
Hey, Nicholas, thanks for having me.
Patri, besides what I already said about you in the intro, what else would you like listeners to know about you to get an idea of who you are and what your work is all about?
Yeah, I'd say mainly my focus has been on competitive governance, on thinking about governments like businesses and governance like an industry, thinking about laws and institutions from the perspective of a software engineer. But I'm also in general just somebody who likes to play in like new spaces with new ideas. And, I've been working crypto and a lot of other different things. But definitely the focus, like for my life and continuing in the future is this governance side of things.
All right. So can you talk a bit more how that idea came about that governments are basically like products that deliver or a good or a bad service to their citizens and can be improved like a product?
Yeah, I guess I just found it like really intuitive, coming from like a family of economists. Also being interested in business, that when it all came about like in my early 20s when I was kind of thinking like, should I live in a different country? Like my country doesn't seem to be very well operated and it also doesn't really fit my values. And at first I was like, well, maybe I'm just from the wrong country. And then I looked at a bunch of other ones and I was like, wait, there's like some that are run better and some that are run worse and some that offer like different packages of like values, but they're all like really, really far off from the degree of like competence and value alignment that I can get with like a good for-profit company. I have like a lot more values alignment with, with my tribe or like, and a lot more like operational competence from like even like I picked like T-Mobile as like kind of like the worst U.S. carrier back then, and like Verizon, AT&T, Sprint, and T-Mobile. I was like, even T-Mobile is like way better than like most government services. Like, why is it like the biggest sector actually does so poorly? And so it was just very natural to me to like apply these lenses of like economics and what are the incentives, and then to think about government as an industry. And it became quickly clear, like, oh, well, like, there's no startups. Of course you don't get innovation. Like, there's no opportunity for small teams with a clean canvas to, like, design and try out new things and have most of them fail, but have a few of them, like, work really well and try those out. So, of course. And so the rest of my career kind of came to be like, okay, well, how can we change that? How can I enable the creation of governance startups? And back then in the early 2000s, governments weren't willing to like work with us on experiments at all. And so that's why I turned to seasteading, because historically like new frontiers had always been a place that automatically gave rise to like new jurisdictions and like kind of the closest we had to startups. But kind of all land was claimed in the 20th century and all frontiers were kind of like closed. And space was just like not ready yet. Still like too difficult and expensive. So I was like, well, let's look at the oceans. There are these ideas out there about ocean cities. It seems like it's kind of just in the middle of like difficult and not done yet, but like possible. And like maybe that's a way that we could open a new space for new jurisdictions, try out new forms of organization, incentives, economics. And that's why I started with seasteading back in like the mid 2000s. I like wrote a book on it and eventually like got funding to start the nonprofit. But then after some years of working on that, kind of like other people's thoughts and efforts in parallel led to Honduras creating the the first version of the Zeta program, changing the constitution in 2010, 2011. And I was like, oh, wow, if we can do this on land, that's, potentially like a lot easier and a lot cheaper. And so kind of since then, I started the first modern charter city startup, Future Cities Development in 2011. I had the first MOU with Honduras, but they kind of it took them a lot of years to actually launch the program. It's not easy to start and run something brand new when you're a small country. And so I ended up working with them for a year and then kind of giving up and doing other things.
Right. So at the ocean was too challenging, or was it a cost issue, or what were the challenges in doing that?
Cost, for sure. Yeah. I mean, I still think that there are some plausible businesses. I think that cruise ships are really underused, both from a regulatory arbitrage perspective. So before Honduras, I was actually going to leave the nonprofit with my co-founder James and start a medical tourism cruise ship company, because that looked like the best bet to me back then, and it still looks like a good bet. I also think as a way of just deploying a package of infrastructure and rooms. Since 2008, ships have been selling for basically scrap cost, and so for just the cost of the steel, you can put a whole bunch of beds and electricity and water and bathrooms and everything in any place with a port. And I think that that's a way to kind of rapidly deploy square meters in a jurisdiction that's being very underused. But in general, the ocean's very expensive, and it's just much, much easier if we can build on land, which countries are now willing to do.
Mm-hmm. Right. So there's these two options sort of at sea, both in a mobile way with a cruise ship or with sea pods. Then there's on land through agreements or partnerships with existing governments. Now there's also another idea that Balaji Srinivasan proposed, a so-called network state that is starting a community or a tribe in the cloud. Can you kind of compare and trust that idea to your idea of a charter city?
Yeah, I mean, that's something we've said for back into too, the idea of virtual. The thing is that basically, if you look at from the industry model, in the virtual world, costs of switching providers and barriers to entry are really low. So barriers to entry is how hard is it to start a new provider? In nation states, it's really, really hard to start a new country. It's really, really easy to start a new digital nation. Not easy to start one that provides the things that a traditional nation state do. And then the other is cost of switching. It's hard to change your country. More and more people are able to change their country, and that puts more competitive pressure on governments. And we see governments trying to compete harder for people with things like the digital nomad visas and programs. And online, switching costs are super, super low, and it's really competitive. And so online already has the characteristics that lead to much more rapid innovation of jurisdictions. And that's why I think we find much more values alignment and much higher levels of operational excellence online. And so that's great. My focus has always been, hey, how can we bring those features, the innovation of technology in the world of bits, into this really, really important place of government? Because the thing is that government, it's basically a virtual, even though it's enforced in the physical world, from a conceptually, it is a virtual infrastructure layer. The association of a body of law with a piece of property is just bits in people's mind. And you can change what bodies of law apply to a contract or to a piece of property just by flipping those bits, right? Just by contracting out of them. And so it's being done in a world of atoms, limited, controlled way right now. But I think it's actually fundamentally much more like bits and software. And so trying to get it to be that way is kind of my focus as something that seems really worth doing to me. And so the people who are doing, and I work with Balaji, and I'm involved in some network state projects. Like, I think like having the digital world like take over or replace some of the things traditionally done by nation states is a great idea, and I'm happy to work on it. But to me, it's like not the big gap. It's not like the thing that really like needs to happen that's really holding people back.
Yeah, and to me, it seems like the argument that you made, it's kind of about the switching costs. So right now, the model for an entrepreneur to start a new charter city is kind of like you need to already have a lot of existing social capital locally on the ground to get kind of to an MOU with an existing government. And you also need sort of a lot of expertise in things like real estate and building the physical world, right? So the upfront costs for that are probably in the several millions or tens of millions, right? And with the network state, you can kind of start earlier and then kind of get to that higher upfront cost, more capital intensive parts later, right?
Yeah, I think that's super important for sure. And, I love what like Praxis has done with this, innovating and said like, hey, because I think like even though like the Honduras program is incredible and prospers like the 0 to 1, it's like the leading company in this industry. I feel like it kind of spoiled us in that it was driven by the country and not by like the movement, which is great. But also like they changed their constitution before there was like companies. And that kind of led us to a mindset of like, oh, first you work with the country, you get them to pass the regulation, then you like start companies that work within it. And that's really bad because it requires putting a lot of effort, and maybe capital in ahead of like a regulation, which can easily like not get passed. And I think the model of like practice of aggregating demand, forming a community of people who want to live together, and then growing that community and growing the social cohesion within it, and talking to multiple sovereigns, and kind of like, all right, like we'll ink a deal, but we're not going to like start building until you like pass the law, and we like actually form our community first. I think is really powerful, important way, and that's something that both Praxis and Balaji have like innovated on, is like using the cloud to address the like what we call in this business the cold start problem. Like cities are based partly on network effects, and so starting a new city is always going to be a super uphill battle because you don't have these network effects. That's the cold start problem, and anything you can do to address that, like building up a digital group, a collective first, is addressing like one of like the core challenges, and so is super helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally agree. Let's get a bit to the venture funding side of these new network stage / startup cities or charter cities. What's the defining? So how did Pronomos develop over time? Sort of in the beginning when you started, what was the deal flow, and what is it now? How has that developed?
Yeah, it's funny because I think compared to like other venture fields where people get like, you might get like 10 pitches a day, or like a big fund, like 100 pitches a day or something. I remember it was like February of 2020, I think, after we did our first close, and it was like I got like a new pitch every week for 4 weeks in a row, like for a month. And I was like, holy crap, dude, it's happening. Like, oh my God, I just saw 4 different new companies in a month. And so, it's a super new field. And so that part is super different. And, we're definitely shifting to more of a studio model this year. My co-GP, Bradford, has experience like starting and running venture studios. And we're just kind of finding that part of this being like a frontier space is like often the companies are being started by people outside of mainstream startup culture, like which is great, but they are often not using the best practices in terms of like documents and intellectual property agreements and cap tables and things like that. And, we're really wanting to kind of like get more hands-on. We're mostly doing this with our company, Small Farm Cities, but kind of get more hands-on at working with companies from very early and actually like starting some ourselves so that we can kind of architect them with Silicon Valley best practices from the ground up, even if like the main operational founders are still kind of people from outside the startup ecosystem.
Great. I want to hear more about that a bit later. Before we get there, why or what made you think that venture capital is sort of the right vehicle to supercharge that movement in the first place?
Yeah, so definitely, it definitely like needed an investment vehicle. And I think, I'm open to like discussion about what form that should take. But for me, having worked on this, for so long, like more like 15 years, when I started designing the fund in 2017, I really wanted to work across projects. And, being on the funding side is kind of a natural way to work across projects. And it's also something that like all projects need funding. And if they each have to like individually prove themselves to investors, that's a lot harder than if someone like me can kind of roll them up into one fund entity and go to investors and say like, hey, I've been working on this stuff forever and I feel like it's finally investable now and here's why. And like, I'm going to pick out the good projects. So that's been great. In terms of, there's this really weird thing where I think charter cities kind of at the very beginning, they're very venture-like, where there's like low capital costs and like high risks. But it's just a team that's like flying around, developing their concept, talking to prospective tenants, talking to potential governments, trying to form their community vision. Like it's not that expensive. And it's also, it's very kind of like high risk, high rate of failure. And if they succeed, they're managing like giant real estate projects, and that's worth a lot. So you have potential for venture returns. But at some point, pretty early on, it kind of like transforms from venture-like profile to real estate-like profile. And whether that's just like the property holding entities of these things early on as they get regulation passed and start developing, or just kind of like the entire thing once they're really like operating and they have like rent rolls and growth rates and stuff, and it just like looks like a high growth real estate management company. So there's still a lot of need for helping companies get funded to make that transition. And there's a gap in like the next stage. Like we mainly do kind of pre-seed and seed. We write checks of like 100K to $1 million. But there's still a big gap in the, I'd say kind of like 1 million to 100 million funding to help companies get to where they're actually like built and operating and have revenue and are de-risked and can probably go to like traditional development finance. And we're kind of like working with companies to explore how we can help there. And definitely there's some places there where it should probably not be venture, where it should probably be more like private equity, traditional real estate financing, debt financing, things like that we're going to explore for our future entities. But I think at the very early stages, it looks very much venture-like. And I think that this is like clearly a time when we need cross-company, horizontal funding institutions.
Yeah, great. I mean, I would compare and contrast that with how many people would imagine, how would you fund a new city? Well, you have like a big development agency, like a World Bank or African Development Bank or government, and they give like 100 million or several billion to do it, right? So your kind of key innovation is to start earlier and focus on sort of the intangibles that a group or a company needs to build to sort of properly start building a city, like the governance services, the laws, and basically the agreements with local like policymakers or polities, right?
Yeah, I mean, you can look at this from like the city theory perspective of someone like Jane Jacobs and say like it's actually like there's this I feel like a lot of what I do is like there's places where our intuitions are super, super wrong. And if you actually, instead of using your intuitions, do first principles thinking, you can see it. And so like the intuition is that you can just like subsidize things. That if you pay for things, you can make things. And like you can subsidize any kind of one-time thing. You can like pay to make a building. But when you're trying to subsidize something that's going to generate a stream of value over time, subsidizing a business, or even like a nonprofit, it's actually like really, really, really hard and like mostly doesn't work. And in the case of like cities, if you subsidize building something that doesn't have actual like demand and a set of people who would like rather live there and where there's like jobs they can do, they can't do other places, it mostly doesn't work. And that's a challenge that like the Middle East is facing as they try to like deploy capital into like cities that they hope will like make them money when the oil runs out. It's like, it's actually like really, really hard. Or you can look at it from the startup perspective, which says like, hey, like before you have product market fit, you need to be like really, really careful with how much capital you deploy and deploy it like pretty minimally. And you don't like scale up and pour in capital until you have like a proven growth engine with like working unit economics. So kind of like both of those approaches, both of those say like, hey, I mean, subsidies are helpful, but they're just, people think that they're like automatic, and like getting somebody to give you $100 million for a first build versus like having somebody invest $100 million for a first build. But like, yeah, the person who's investing, even if they're highly motivated, like that's going to fall through a lot. It's going to fall through like sometimes because they wrongly like look at your project and say like this is not going to make money down the road. Most of the time it's going to fall through because most projects are not actually going to like, even if they had free money, like the unit economics don't work. They're like not actually going to like make money and grow over time.
Yeah, exactly. Something that I worked on in my times in academia was the study of mega projects, right? So 9 out of 10 and even more like large projects, like over $1 billion plus, like large airports, roads, or public infrastructure are over time and over budget, right? Because they're almost always done in a custom way because everyone wants it the way they want. And when it's custom, you kind of need entrepreneurs to figure out the unknown, right? So you can't just throw money at the problem, right? There's many risk factors that make it just inherently very uncertain, to do these very large scale undertakings, right? So what you do instead is you should modularize, you should start smaller and things like that, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk a bit more about the business models of these projects? Is there like one or two or three dominant ones, or are they all different?
Yeah, I'd say there's a pretty small number of business models. And for me, like I got into this trying to like start new jurisdictions with different laws. And it kind of turned out to like mostly be like real estate companies, which is really wacky. And so what's different from normal real estate is that in addition to like rents and like capital appreciation, you also have like taxes. So what I think is like the standard charter city model is that you are, just like a real estate project that starts on empty land and maybe tries to get government concessions or something, they're trying to like create economic activity where it doesn't exist. And then they capture some of that with rents. And what a charter city is doing is a different value driver. So they're creating economic activity with like not just some superficial concession with this like dramatic rezoning of land to have different laws and institutions, but they're still just trying to take like real world space that has no economic activity and get investment and get people there and get economic activity and then capture a share of what they create with rents and with taxes. But actually, as a libertarian, I was always like very against taxes. And now I'm kind of like, wait, like taxes, it's basically like an equity share in the economy that you create, right? Because like a percentage of like income tax, personal or corporate, it's like a percentage of earnings. That's like kind of like taking a percentage of GDP. It's basically like a rev share or like, it's an equity stake. And actually, I think if you have like a private entity creating a jurisdiction, like having them have an equity stake in the economic activity is actually kind of the right incentive and like a really, really good thing.
Yeah, it's like when you use Stripe, right? Sort of you have these payment fees of like 1% or 2% or something, right? And, that seems like a very viable business model and that aligns incentives very well with them. And so every time when Patrick, you still there?
Uh,
I still hear you.
yeah, no, it's like when I open a certain window. Here, all right, I just made it go away.
Yeah, yeah.
Like my other browser tab like freezes video, so I don't know why.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Right.
no worries.
So I just made it go away.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just thinking because just yesterday I did my my VAT taxes in Prospera, right? And it's just way easier than ever doing taxes before. And so easy, in fact, that I was just very happy to pay it, right? Because it's just this short form that you can do like in a minute or two, where you just got to check, oh, well, in my case, I organize conferences, right? So I pay basically VAT on the revenue that I generated of like 1%. And then I just report what I made. And then I pay that. That's compared to when I pay taxes like in Germany, where I have to pay like a software or a lawyer to pay them, right? So you have to pay the customer service to get the
I think I was like over indexed on libertarianism when I was younger. It's kind of like, look, if the state is doing a really crappy job, then of course we want to like opt out of it. But actually, a lot of that is just like, oh, if you're going to do a bad job, let me do it myself. Like, I still feel like I should have the option to opt out of state services, and I prefer decentralized and private things. But if the state actually does like a good job, in the same way that like there was a period where like I pirated a lot of like movies and music, but like now that there's like good streaming services, it's like not worth it to me, like the downsides of doing that. And I'm kind of like happy that like Netflix and Spotify exist. And so I think when like countries are like well run, we're actually like, like my libertarian instinct doesn't go to zero, but it's actually like a lot. I'm like much more willing to like pay a service provider if like I get good value for the money.
yeah, exactly. And that makes you happy to pay it. And, it's how the economy works in other areas where you voluntarily opt in and have a contract with a company.
That's right.
But back to the fund. So, can you say what is kind of the return profile of these investments that you made with Pronomos? Is there like a model for an exit or an exit scenario? How does that look like?
Yeah. I mean, some parts of this are really easy and some are really hard. So sometimes like investors will ask me for like what I think like the return profile is, like how big will the hits be and how many. And I'm like, dude, no way. Like this is brand new. Nobody's ever done it before. Like we have no idea. I mean, you really don't. In most funds, you have no idea. But like let alone in this one. So we can do some theoretical stuff and say like, look, here's how much more like land is worth, 20 years into Hong Kong or Singapore versus how it was beforehand. And like, here's the price of the real estate on Roatan that Prospera is buying versus the real estate in like the best special economic zone in the region, but those are still kind of pretty vague. So, which is fine. Like, I'm very comfortable with like early stage investing where like, just like, oh, is there a big market? Is there like a big potential multiple? Like, sure. But some things like the exit model, I think those are actually like really, really clear where like real estate is the world's largest asset class. And at the beginning, when these things are like kind of risky venture style investments where it's like, oh, are you going to get the regulations passed? Will businesses actually want to locate there? Will people want to move there? It's kind of risky and uncertain. But as these projects succeed, they just become like high growth, high margin real estate projects. And when you have like a kind of a proven, if you got 5 years of like a growth curve and like tax capture and GDP and like lease rates, it's just a real estate project. So now it's just the largest asset class in the world. And there's tons of capital out there that wants to like buy streams of dividends, right? And give you like a one-time like payout. I think that part's actually really easy. And whether you like sell to private equity or you IPO or you do it via like tokens, like whatever, like getting a one-time exit for profitable real estate is like super, super easy. But in terms of the exact return profile, all I can say is like, yeah, it should be like fewer failures than venture if you do it right. And also like a lower, like you're not going to get like 1,000x the way you could with like Facebook or something. Because I think cities just scale up more slowly and they just like take more years to build out. And so like I actually looked at like, I compared like Singapore and Apple and just in terms of like their total like value. And it's like Singapore was like 10 years earlier and it was like several times more than Apple and it was kind of like roughly like comparable. But like in general, but that's both like very like decades and decades of compounding, like 50, 60 years of compounding. And I think in general, like the degree to which you're gonna be able to grow a city in the first 10 or 20 years versus a software business is just going to be a lot less. But at the same time, once you're deploying like large amounts of capital because you have product market fit, you have like this great downside protection where you actually have hard assets. So I think that you'll have like a lower failure rate, especially as you kind of get a little bit further and like lower multiples. But I'm not willing to say anything kind of more definite than that.
Yeah. I mean, I'm curious just because that is just so out there and a completely new asset class and also great inspiration for me to do my fund, kind of building on top of platforms with better regulations. But what are your learnings in kind of making that pitch for Fund One to investors? How were you able to convince them about a completely new asset class? And what can maybe other fund managers or startup founders learn from that?
I think one thing that I've learned is like, I'm not able to convince anybody who's not already highly aligned and interested. And like, it was kind of a waste of time to try. So our investors are generally like, if you are excited about the mission and believe in it, that means first off that you're willing to invest even if it's not as good a return profile as a generic fund investment, because your money is still going to go to making happen something that you want. And you like expect that you're more likely to get a return because you're already like bought into like the thesis. And there's that kind of double effect. And like anybody who's like has any significant skepticism about the thesis is like, you're never going to convince them to invest in a new thing. So it's really much more about finding the people who are already convinced and showing them like, hey, here's why this particular here's why now like is the time. Here's why like for-profit rather than nonprofit actually works. Answering these questions about like, it's maybe like one way to put it, like flowing off that last question is like, if somebody needs me to like have a spreadsheet with data backing it about like what the distribution of possible returns is like likely to be, even to within a factor of like 3, like there's no way. Whereas if they just want me to help them understand like, oh, what's the value stream and like who are the buyers in an exit and like just answer those questions and then show that I've like thought about it and like probably have good answers for a bunch of similar questions, like that is what you can do as like a fund manager.
Got it.
And that's just going to change over time. I feel like there's a kind of a frontier of like how philosophically aligned does an investor have to be, where like year by year, as we like show that this stuff works and it seems like less crazy, we can just incrementally get the kind of like less and less philosophically aligned investors. So like, I kind of like, I felt like anytime I pitched to like an institution or a committee in like 2018 and 2019 with like Fund One, it was kind of a mistake. And like this year I'm thinking about like, well, if there's like an institution that is really, really aligned, or I have like a strong advocate there who says there's a chance, then like, sure. But I'm kind of like not gonna like go after like institutions kind of like initially.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and it does seem to me, at least looking from the outside, to shift a bit. Also, very largely due to your work, because you're kind of drawing a larger social circle, right? I mean, I think the idea sort of run the experiment, right? So, this city can be super libertarian. The other one has much more government services or whatever in healthcare. That just when I pitch it, maybe I'm not getting investment, but even people who are not sort of aligned on the ideas, they're kind of intuited or at least curious. And sometimes you can even connect it to like their own agenda, for example, in promoting like longevity or biotech, something like that, right? Or like new hardware technology like drones or nuclear power. And hey, these special jurisdictions, if that's a space that's expanding, could be very interesting, sort of as these greenfields or laboratories to try new technology, right? So how did you kind of see that sort of initially, what was initially very, very true believers? How did you already see that social circle expanding, and how do you plan, or how do you think about expanding that even further?
Two things, I mean, I think I'm pretty skeptical of expanding it in most ways, but there's two things. First off, there are people who are true believers in a more meta version of the idea, right? They might not be a believer that a particular private free enterprise focused city works, but they believe that we need new institutions, that old ones are failing, that we should try out new governments. So it's really, really important to be selling that meta message and having a big tent, because there are a lot more people who agree on that and might agree on your particular one, and I've really gone to where I still believe in most cases that kind of more private property and more free enterprise zones are most likely to work. But I'm happy to be pitched and convinced on any particular project that follows a different model. So I find that there's a great it's really freeing to be hey, no, I don't have to convince you that I'm right about political philosophy. I don't have to convince you that the mechanisms that I like are actually the right ones. People are always asking me, it's tricky, but oh, give a specific example of a law that you would want to change, or a political system you would want. And it's kind of I get the desire to anchor it in something concrete, but I'm really, really leery, because it's so easy for that to turn into them then arguing with the specifics of that model. It's no, the entire point is what if we had a startup sector for government? You don't have to agree with me about which startup would work. I could be wrong about which startup will work and still completely right. I probably am, and still totally right about the need for a sector. So that's one thing. The other thing is that I think that the circles are expanding automatically. Something that I've experienced is that these ideas that I don't know, my dad was into it in the 90s when he was on the extropians and cypherpunk lists, and I was on from the early 2000s. Ideas like life extension and AI safety and competitive governance. There's a bunch of things that were super, super obscure and fringe back then, because the impact of tech on the world was very, very new, and they were very much this new way of thinking that some of us early adopters were kind of on early, but that you could get all the people who are the major advocates of in nanotechnology, probably 10 different things. You could get everybody at one conference or party in San Francisco, all the major people for all 10 of these things, right? And now there's tens of billions of dollars going to rejuvenation research from big pharma. AI safety has gotten big, probably still not as big as it needs to be, charter cities. So all of these fields have expanded by multiple orders of magnitude in terms of how many people believe in them. And so the number of people who are already sold, just because we were all correct about the way the world was going. We had sniffed the winds, and I found there's this really, really obscure and different way of thinking that relates to technology and new things, that if you reason from it with first principles, you get a bunch of different answers that hardly anybody believes. That nowadays we've had 20 years of technological deployments and people going out there and selling these ideas, and there's literally 1,000 times as many people or more. Number of people who believe that like inflation happens because central banks like print currency and they're always going to do it with fiat money. And if you had like some way of like limiting supply, whether that's like Bitcoin or like commodities or whatever, like you would actually like fix inflation. That'd be a good thing. I mean, there was probably like tens of thousands of those people in the late 90s, right? And now I think there's like tens of millions. So like literally 1,000x growth in some of these ideas. So the number of people who are already convinced is like way higher and growing rapidly. And I feel like our task is much more to like kind of like find the best version of our vision and explain it in the best way and like help recruit those people and help network them with each other. And like we don't need to be kind of like selling it to like noobs anymore. Like that's already happened.
Yeah, exactly. That I was also thinking of. I see kind of also two kind of vectors that go more in that direction. One is Bitcoin and blockchain technology, right? As you just said, it kind of supercharged that movement. So there's just millions of people that kind of now financially benefit of opting into that sort of system of decentralizing money. And to do that, that comes with a little bit of a basic education. Why are we doing this in the first place, right? So I think that opens people up more to other ideas as well. Where else to apply that to and what else to decentralize or privatize. And the second, I think there's also increasingly an expansion of the Silicon Valley model happening, right? So venture capital was for a long time very geographically confined to like the United States and to the West Coast. And that's now also increasingly globalizing. For example, part of like a venture accelerator that's doing like hundreds of new venture capital funds, many of them in Latin America or Africa. And I think also Silicon Valley culture, starting a new company, is also kind of inherently kind of, libertarian but also just whatever your ideology is, you want to make something work practically. You start small and, you go out there and you challenge conventional views and you do it differently. You build different institutions and different things, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, with that said, is there any success cases in your portfolio of Pronomos Fund 1 that you'd like to talk about or specifically highlight?
Sure. I mean, Prospera is the big one, right? Like that's the 0 to 1. They're actually like operating and growing. Two others that I'm excited about, like I think Praxis is the one that I think is like closest to doing like a first build with like really significant autonomy and scale. So I'm really excited to see what's happening with them. Two companies in our portfolio that are kind of really clicking, like that have product market fit are Kift and Small Farm Cities. And they're actually, neither of them is like the traditional like charter city starting with like regulation. They're both starting in a different way, but they're still competitive governance. So Kift is a van life community in the west coast of the US. So it's providing hubs like houses that have showers and gyms and Starlink internet so that a van life community can like come together. But it's actually like even more about those infrastructure hubs. It's about the community. So they have a shared culture and they have rituals and they get together and check in every morning and they cook dinner together every night. And actually the members, even when they're like leaving a neighborhood and you would think that being a nomad would be like more atomized by being part of Kift, they're actually having more community than they did before. And so that's growing really fast. We're really excited about it. And, basically making people more mobile means that jurisdictions have to compete for them. Like the two arms of my theory from like 2002 of competitive governance was lower the barrier to entry. In other words, make it easier to start new jurisdictions and lower the cost of switching. Make it easier for people to like switch jurisdictions because both of those things increase competitive pressure. And I've done almost all of my work on that barrier to entry, but things that lower the cost of switching also result in better government because governments then have to compete more for people. And then the other one, Small Farm Cities in Malawi, it's basically like just taking empty land and building out hydroponic greenhouses and fish farms. and creating villages and eventually like towns. So they have a whole idea for how you go from like 10 to 100 to 1,000 to 10,000 person farming communities, and share infrastructure. And like they're vertically integrated. So basically in Africa, there's like big central driven development that happens that works pretty well, like Rendeavor scale projects. But then at the bottom end, it's mostly just like people building things by hand in a really crappy way. There's not much like systematic small and medium scale development. And so they've had to like kind of come up with everything. They have like the economic model for what they're building, for who's going to do what jobs. They even have like the building technology. It's like a rammed earth, and kind of like the infrastructure stack for the villages. And, they've built the first couple of sites, and they're working really well. The payback period is like less than 2 years, maybe as short as like a year. And, if you can make like profitable farming, and so it's like they make like the greenhouses, and then they make the houses for the people who like live there and operate them. And then as they scale up, they make like the schools and the recreational facilities. And if you can just like make a small profitable economy, like in Africa, like the market for that is insane, right? There's like no reason that this is like not Malawi specific in any way. It can work in like any underdeveloped part in Africa. And so that one's like really ticking. And that's the one where we've been, especially my partner Bradford, we've been like really heavily involved in helping to improve their finances and reporting and their their contracts and agreements, and then kind of really helping them think about growth and scale, like with the benefit of Silicon Valley wisdom. So we've been involved really closely, and we're super excited about that. Like we took their whole like last round. Also, capital costs are like low in Africa, but like we did a first investment a couple of years ago, and then they did like a second investment, and we just like took the whole thing, because we're like really optimistic. And then we'll work with them to raise like a bigger round from outside capital next.
Fantastic. Now I'd love to hear a bit more about the your thinking when it comes to building a venture studio with Pronomos Capital for future funds or future investments.
Yeah, all right. Venture studio.
Mm-hmm.
So there's always economies of scale in starting companies. And I think when you're doing something like really, really new, that's especially true. And so that's one factor. Another factor is that we think that kind of like Silicon Valley best practices are kind of like not that well known among a lot of these founders, and we can like really help by bringing them. And another factor, I mean, I guess this is just another version of economies of scale, but like we think of governments like a really, really big enterprise customer. They're kind of like the mega enterprise, and it's just very slow and it's going to fall through a lot. And so it's really important to not be like dependent on one of those partners, but to have a sales pipeline of multiple ones, like as Praxis is doing by talking to like multiple countries. And I think that it like really makes sense to have a studio model that we're going to do where like we have a pipeline of country and project opportunities that we're developing, and kind of like the earlier it is, like the less we invest, we do some amount of kind of speccing out like the target industries, and the regulations needed and like prospective tenants. And then we have like a small team of like entrepreneurs. And then as a project gets more solid, we like actually form a company and have them kind of work full time on that. But until then, they're doing this like slow, long lead time development with a bunch of countries at the same time. So I think that that's going to be like really helpful.
So the lead time development, is that done by you or by entrepreneurs that are joining the venture studio? Or how?
Right now I'm thinking about hiring somebody who specializes in government relations to run that portfolio. Mm-hmm. So our key hire right now is that we're looking for like a chief of staff, sort of a COO. That position's been open for a few months. We're looking for somebody who has experience at like a top tier, like high growth startup. and is very, very like operational and like execution minded. And we think this position has like really, really high leverage in the space. Basically, the person who kind of like puts into practice the ideas of the general partners, Bradford and I. And then like the second position to hire for is this government relations. Somebody who just kind of like is on the road all the time, meeting different government officials, and also doing like Zooms and kind of like talking them through the benefits, cultivating relationships, helping them work on legislation and like shepherd it through. So I think that, but like a great company like Praxis, they're able to do that in-house.
Okay, great. But then are there entrepreneurs kind of coming to work with you that you then kind of help to get started, or will there kind of be an application, and how will that look like? What will be the profile that you're aiming for?
So what we've done so far is we've just kind of been like talking to people privately, and we have someone that we're gonna like work with this year. But ideally, what I want is I kind of think of it as like a matching problem with two pipelines. Pipeline of projects and the pipeline of founders. And we're helping to cultivate both of those pipelines. And as projects get ready, and as like there's founders that we trust and are ready, we kind of like put them together. But you want to have a lot more projects than founders, because I think at the early stage, like one founder can work on like multiple country opportunities. And if this was happening at scale, we would want kind of like a pool of founders who we were vetting, and it was kind of like, oh, this project is now ready to go from like us doing a few hours a week developing it to like somebody's going to work like 10 hours a week, and in 3 months, 20 hours a week, and in 6 months, 40 hours a week on it. Like we want to put together a founding team. We'd love to like have that pool of people, but right now it's small scale enough that we're just like looking for just like a few entrepreneurs to work with. We're not really like kind of putting out like a call, but anybody who has I used to think that you needed like real estate development experience. I now think that like it's like by far the dominating thing is just startup experience, and just having that culture and that experience and that mindset of being a startup founder, which is super rare. And I actually think like a distant second, but like the second skill is more like community building, because that really is what these projects are, is like building a community of like businesses and tenants. But anybody who's like ready to get into charter cities full time and has like, multiple successful startups, or like one successful startup or like a bunch of not successful, but like good shots on goal startups, should contact us, because we're like very much short of and looking for those people.
Great. Yeah, it could be something for a founder who had an exit, and then then they're often looking for something that's sort of higher impact to what they've done before, maybe more moonshots. So experienced builders want it.
Yeah,
great.
We have some of those people, but like mostly who like aren't ready to found like now, And it's like a number of people who are like, oh yeah, I believe that charter cities are going to be a big thing. I want that to be my next thing. I'm like ready. It's a small number of people.
Great. What else do we need more of? What other barriers do you see to scale where we are right now even further?
I mean, I think the biggest is definitely like founders. I also think kind of like credibility is important, like to land these big enterprise partnerships. I chose this approach because I was like, wait, I want to find a way of improving institutions that doesn't require like convincing 51% of voters, because that's like absurd. Like I don't know. We didn't like have to convince 51% of like long distance phone users to like try out like new cheap long distance calling, in order to launch it or whatever. Like it's absurd and it doesn't work. But that said, there is still like you do need to convince. So institutional credibility and academic work and such there really helps. Although we're definitely thinking more and more about like small farm cities, like how can you get started like and do something significant like without even having regulations or government approval. But like I didn't start Pronomos to just invest in like random real estate projects in the developing world. Like, I have to really believe, like, okay, even if you're starting without this, there's a clear reason why you need it, and there's reasons why you think you'll get it, and there's like a path to getting significant like governance autonomy. Yeah, what else is needed? Like later stage capital. Like, I think that like it's pretty, the industry is pretty good for like the early stage, like pre-seed and seed capital, but people who are writing like $1 to $25 million checks to kind of fund like first builds in some places, or like bigger builds in cheaper places. I think that's still like a big hole. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, what you said about credibility is interesting. I mean, I haven't been in this space for that long, but what seems to me a common challenge, or kind of almost a key challenge of any of these projects is, or any startup for that matter, is to build credibility, right? You always start as this small kind of ragtag group. And as you get bigger, sort of in the early adopter curve or life cycle, you have, as you get closer to the 51%, I mean, you do eventually want large majorities to adopt you, but you got somewhere to start small with like a 0.1% that's willing to give you a chance, and then build credibility over time with like partnerships with other governments, or like ICO safety certifications, and
I mean,
it's like
look at
adding
like
things on top to
like
make yourself kind of
small
more
and building
credible
product,
to a
and
larger
then, like,
audience.
building market share over time.
That's
like another thing you can look at is like clinical drug trials. Is like eventually, like, I don't know, maybe like some tens of percent of people should be on like statins, or like metformin or something, but like, most people shouldn't be. And certainly like at the beginning, you want to be like testing it in test tubes, and like testing it on like mice, and then monkeys, and then on like 10 humans, and then 100 humans, and then like 1,000 humans. And you want to be like scaling it up like very carefully, like as it's proven to work. I think that's like even more true of governance than of like medical treatments, because it's like kind of like even more like risk and danger if it's done poorly. And so you just want to be like even more like careful and methodical. At the same time, like, you can't like eliminate innovation in that space because it's so important. Like, we tend to put up too high barriers, and then that really, really costs us. Whether it's like too few medical treatments being developed, or like too few new countries being started. Like, we really, really need innovation. It's just, it has to be done carefully. But it's a disaster when it's not done at all, which is kind of like the default.
Yeah, yeah. And also kind of to extrapolate on that, like, we need to do it better. Like in startups, you need to do it 10 times better than the incumbents usually, because people have status quo bias. So you need to be multiple times better to have a chance at greater adoption. At the same time, we need to build credibility, but also stick to principles, right? Because what many people find credible is if like the FDA or some government authority says yes, but the FDA is not like the mature thing. It's pretty awful and pretty bad, right? So having this kind of as the end point, oh no, we're credible because they say yes to us, that also can't be the point, right? So a big challenge also in that space will be to be very methodical, very ethical, and very thought through when it comes to kind of the principles and why we're doing this, right? And kind of achieve credibility, but not
a podcast
compromising
I'm
on some
about
core
starting this
principles
year
or ways
related
that
to
we
like
actually
the
want to
scaling
change,
up
right?
of a lot of these ideas. Is it's like, who are the people who worked in the 20th century on the things that now in the 21st century are becoming really big, and whether that's like AI risk or life extension technology or virtual reality, or competitive governance. Like, what were their core principles? Like, which of those have been kept as it scaled, and which were like forgotten and left behind, and which like shouldn't have been? And just kind of like a lot of those like original thinkers who helped kind of create the underpinnings for these technologies, a lot of them, they're not extroverts. They're not branding people. They're not self-promoters. They're like shy, introverted, Asperger's like nerds, and who are like kind of not being heard now. And so I'm really interested in starting a podcast to like kind of go and like find those people and feature them and be like, hey, like maybe we don't want to follow their first principles, but let's at least hear what they were and like think through whether they're good or bad and consider whether now this stuff is like fitting and scaling, we might want to do things. Oh, thank you.
That's such a great idea, and I have a couple of ideas for guests and people that really love to talk about this.
I did, yeah. I just
one, for example, I'm actually going to have him on my podcast in the coming weeks, Eric Voorhees, right? So it just fascinated me when he had that debate with Sam Bankman-Fried. Like, not sure if you've seen that. Yeah. Yeah, great. Yeah, it was like, so Eric Voorhees and Sam Bankman-Fried had this debate like 12 days before the FTX meltdown. And, you know, Eric just was this very principled, thought-through guy, and he was just very precisely exposing flaws in Sam Bankman-Fried's thinking, like meticulously. And you could really see, hey, here's someone who, you know, has a point of view that not everyone agrees with, but he thought it through very clearly and has like very clear principles, and someone else who clearly hasn't. And then it was kind of like, that's what ultimately happened to him, was almost like prophetic, like as soon as, you know, the house of cards was falling apart. So yeah, that podcast is going to be super interesting. Really looking forward to that. Patri, anything else you want to give? Any other shout outs you want to make? Anything else you're looking for right now? Who should contact you, and how can they find you?
Stuff out there, but we're fixing that right now, and we're going to be doing podcasts and blog posts and you know, video content and like way more stuff this year. So I would say follow me at Patrissimo on Twitter, and Pronomos, which is Pronomos VC. And we have a portfolio page at pronomos.vc/portfolio, which lists like the social media. We've kind of recently updated it with like all the social media channels for like all of our portfolio. And so it's like a great place.
Fantastic. Patri, it was really epic to have you on this podcast. Probably, for me personally at least, my longest awaited guest, because your work, your father, your grandfather has been hugely influential to me, especially your work on sort of making that final step of like, hey, how do we like practically improve things? Like, that's been a huge inspiration to me, to this podcast, and to the VC fund that I'm doing with Infinita, seeking out and finding Prosper in the first place. So thanks so much for coming on the show, Patri. Fantastic.